Thank you for spending your morning or your afternoon or early evening, depending where you are in the world. I want to welcome everyone for joining our webinar on optimizing revenues and profits for the auto service repair and tire retail industry. So what are we going to talk about today? We'll explore tactics for smart pricing and revenue growth management in this space. My name is Armin Kokosh, the founder of Revology Analytics, and I'll be guiding you through the webinar. I also have a distinct pleasure to have Chris Holman, our co-presenter, who I would label as one of the few true unicorns in the industry. Chris is a formal education in statistics and data science, and is probably the only person I know in the automotive retail industry who can sort of blend a very heavy advanced analytics, AI, machine learning acumen with the actual practical realities of being a store operator. He knows a ton about this industry, and he'll be a really good complement to some of the topics that we're going to talk about. So, Chris, thank you for joining me in this discussion, and let's get started. Okay, so we're going to talk about pricing and revenue management, right? Auto service industry, if some of you are not familiar, it's a very competitive industry. Strategic pricing is essential to maximizing profits. And one of the reasons we're doing this webinar is, despite being very powerful, pricing actually remains very underinvested in this sector. It's often overlooked in favor of other functions and capabilities. And so we'll talk about how advanced analytics can actually guide insights-driven decision-making and helping us implement sophisticated pricing and revenue management techniques that can actually grow car count and grow profits for our stores or chain of stores. And so one of the things you see on the right side on the screen is sort of pricing capabilities maturity, progression. We tend to think of these capabilities for most kind of retail industries. This is not unique to auto service retailers, but for the most part, when we talk to clients and when we talk to folks that sort of operate in the space, most people are kind of in this gut-based, cost-based, competitive-based kind of pricing capability, right? So what is my cost? I'm going to apply a flat markup, and that's my price to the customer. Or what is the competition doing, to the extent that I can scrape the prices, and I'm going to align the prices based on that, right? And so that's all good. Where we need to be, right, as an industry, sort of in this value-based / behavioral-based. So value-based, I should know what my differential value is relative to competition, and behavioral, right? So I should know who my buyers are, who the key segments are, their purchase frequencies, some predictions about their behaviors, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Competitive pricing is the foundation to smart pricing and revenue management in the space. And to set competitive prices, right, you need detailed insights into your competitors' pricing strategies. So you start with digital research on competitor websites, social media to gather advertised pricing and promotions. You can use automated price scraping tools for real-time data on local competitors. And you want to sort of build a comprehensive repository of competitive pricing categories by zip code, vehicle make and model, vehicle mileage, specific repair jobs. Mystery shopping is another popular one. There's firms that do this, but especially for lots of service packages and various repair jobs, that is much harder to scrape than, let's say, tire prices. Mystery shopping is a good way to get that competitive intelligence. And then, of course, you can collect customer feedback, right, on the quotes that they've received, especially the ones that have been declined, or that they went to competition, to sort of help you refine your pricing strategies. There's also websites like RepairPal. They can offer localized estimates of competitor prices, and that's a really good way to sort of scrape those sites and build up your competitive pricing database. What you want to focus on is creating these sort of competitive pricing indices, what we call CPIs, for various products and services, right, to be able to kind of compare your prices against competition. And so you see an example on the slide on the right side where the CPI is just simply an index. It's our price relative to their competition's price multiplied by 100. So 105 means that we're 5% more expensive than competition. 95 means that we're 5% cheaper. There's also a related concept around CPI elasticity, right, which is very similar to price elasticity or price sensitivity. Typically, price sensitivity measures the change in demand for percent change in pricing. And so it's a similar concept, right? It basically measures how demand for our services and demand in our space, right, as car count, how that changes given how price competitiveness changes. So if a CPI goes from let's say 100 to 102, right? We're 2% more expensive than competition all of a sudden. And the elasticity is -2, then we expect car count to decline by 4%, right? So 2% times -2 is -4%. And that's sort of the logic with CPI elasticities. Okay. Next up, we'll talk about segmentation. So as we think about pricing and revenue management capabilities, right, just having a strong segmentation of our stores as well as our customers is incredibly important, right? So segmenting the stores based on local market conditions allows us to actually do some tailored pricing strategies, right? That align with particular demographics, market dynamics, et cetera. So one of the things that you see on the screen, right? It's really hard to kind of read, but this is how we tend to think about store segmentation, right? And you can make this as simple or as complex, but you can essentially segment your stores based on competitive density. So how many competitors are there within, typically kind of a 10, 15-mile radius, right? Typically, majority of your sales are going to be happening within a 10-mile radius. And what is the shopper incomes, right? You see that on the vertical axis, right? So are we talking about lower income people, higher income people, et cetera, et cetera? And again, all this is information that's very easily sort of available to you, typically public information that you can scrape. And so there's sort of two opposing kind of areas, right? You have stores that have a low competitive density, a very high shopper income, right? And so for those areas, you can maintain a higher CPIs, right? You can be a little bit more expensive than competition. You can focus on premium offerings, right? Exceptional service quality. And the opposite spectrum, right? You see that on the bottom left side. You have low income, high competition areas, right? You should actually use slightly more aggressive pricing. So that CPI concept that we talked about initially, which is your competitive price index, it needs to be a little bit lower to actually attract those price sensitive customers. And so this is a fairly simple but fairly logical way to think about segmenting your stores and implementing a logical pricing strategy that aligns with these. And so maybe on this one, Chris, you can sort of share your experience with the group on implementing segmented pricing within the same market, and particularly sort of how do we overcome some of the employee resistance to this?
Yeah, and what I would say is that in my experience, like, one of the concerns that maybe operations leadership will have is, how can we potentially have different pricing in different stores within the same market? And in my experience, customers never notice, and that's mainly due to the lack of transparency in pricing in this industry. It's not like you're a gas station with your price posted at the street. So the ability to charge different prices, in one of my former companies, we literally would have two stores on the same street within less than a mile of each other, and we may price them differently based upon the customers that were coming into those stores, due to the traffic patterns. The bigger objection that you run into is can employees accept that some stores are priced different than others. And so that's where the education piece for why you do what you do in terms of pricing is important. In some of the businesses I've been in, stores may actually share employees. An employee may work at one store one day and another store the next day. So I think it's important. The education piece for employees is important. And honestly, they're the biggest hurdle. Like I said, customers, in doing this for years, never had a complaint or anybody ever noticed. I'm not saying they don't exist, but it's very rare that a customer would actually visit two different stores and actually notice that the pricing is different, especially in this industry, because the frequency of visits is so few and far in between that customer recall of what they paid last time is very poor.
That's perfect. Thank you, Chris. Good. So we talked about segmentation, right? We talked about CPIs or competitive price indices initially. And so, sort of the next capability topic, if you will, right around pricing revenue management is sort of, how do we implement insight-based automated pricing adjustments, right? And how do we do that based on CPI data, again, like actual price competitiveness for key services and products relative to your competition? How do we do that based on elasticity insights? Again, this notion of how demand, car count changes relative to how your price competitiveness changes. and the store segmentation, right? Like, how do we do all these things to be competitive? And so, one of the simple things we do in retail, right, is we categorize our products and services strategically, right? So we use loss leaders like oil changes, tire rotations. We use that to actually drive traffic, to build customer relationships. We price premium services like complex repairs, et cetera, higher, right, to actually maximize our profitability and profits. And for mid-range services like common maintenance items, we obviously want to balance competitiveness and profitability, and that's where the segmentation aspect comes in. And so what you see on the screen, and we'll see this chart again in a subsequent slide, right? Kind of typical products and services that we offer in our industry, right? Kind of organized by GP per unit. So what is a gross profit per unit of item or service? And we see the sales volume. So obviously things like lube, oil filter changes, right? Very popular, high sales volume, but very low GP per unit, even though it has a reasonable gross margin percentage. Green is the highest gross margin percentage, red is the lowest. So look at passenger tires, pretty low in terms of gross margin percentage relative to all the things that we offer in our auto repair shops. But on a GP per unit basis, especially considering that most customers buy a set of 4 tires, it's actually really high. Should be more on the right side. So pay attention to that as we price products and as we try to influence the mix. One of the things that I'm actually interested in is Chris kind of used to do this all the time in kind of prior world, especially places like Valvoline. Like, do you mind maybe sharing like how frequent services like loss leaders can build customer trust, and sort of about the importance of educating your employees on the long-term value of these strategies?
Yeah. So certainly, I think the one thing that I've learned over the years is that trust is everything in this industry, and one of the best ways to build that is through repetition. And I think the idea of using something like a loss leader to kind of build a relationship with somebody over time, in order that when it does come time for a larger, more expensive repair or job, it's a very viable strategy. I think the challenge many times for operators is getting the frontline employees to understand strategy, especially if maybe you're doing heavy discounting on something like an oil change, because obviously there's a tendency, I think, in this industry towards cost plus pricing, and a desire to want to make money on every single item and make a certain margin percent. And that can be a little short-sighted, and ultimately that can filter down to the frontline employees. At one of my former engagements, the employees came up with their own lingo for a customer who was coming in just for a cheap oil change. They called them ticket killers, and actually they would actually yell out TK. That was their lingo. If they knew that a car was pulling up with a coupon, they would communicate that to the service advisor. And the thing that I think it's important for employees to understand is the value of that customer goes far beyond that initial visit or that one-time transaction, and educating them about what's the long-term value of those customers over the next 12, 24 months helps to overcome that objection to, well, I may not get a lot of money from that customer today, but it'll pay off in the long run. And I think that's the education process that's important, is educating employees on what's the long-term value of that customer.
Yeah, that's perfect, Chris. And I love the acronym for those customers. This is I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. This is sort of an example of we wanted to illustrate that dynamic pricing, or dynamic automated pricing, doesn't have to be complicated, right? Like, we are all talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning and generative AI, blah blah blah, right? It's certainly in its hype phase. When we think about setting up dynamic pricing, it can be fairly simple. There's an example, I think, from specialty retail, just sort of an oversimplified version, but you can maybe spend some more time looking at the slides. But one of the easiest things you can do is, again, segment your products and services sort of in those categories that we talked about, right? So what are my anchor products and anchor items? What are my value perception items, i.e., for my automotive repair shop, right, or retail store? Like, what am I known for? When customers think about my brand, what am I known for? Am I the quickest one, the most premium? Do I have the biggest breadth of kind of services available, right? But think about what that is, and you need to kind of organize your items that way. Background items are just simply items that are, make a majority of the assortment that we have, or these are services that make a majority of the car cam, but they're otherwise not that profitable. And so one of the easiest things you can do is actually just create sort of an indexing approach where you have a pricing category here in these columns, and you have baseline CPIs, or competitive price indices, that we talked about initially. And these baseline CPIs are dependent on how price sensitive this particular product category is. And then all you do is you make some adjustments to it, right? So what is my goal? Is my goal to maximize gross profits for a particular category? Is it to maximize car count, right? If the intent is to maximize car count, I want to be more competitive, right? So I'll have a lower CPI, right? Below 100, I'm cheaper than competition. If I want to maximize gross profit, maybe it's in my high income, low competitive density stores, right? I'm going to sort of increase the CPI a little bit. And so as you just wrap your head around dynamic pricing, it doesn't have to be real-time optimization, right? It can be as simple as creating a logical kind of a step approach that mimics how you as the business owner, or the executive, or you as the private equity owner of this retail chain would think about. Okay. Value-based pricing, right? So we talked about that a little bit earlier. What does it do? It emphasizes sort of that unique value proposition that your services offer. And so again, we talked about affluent areas, particularly ones that have low competitive density. You can easily add, right, 50 to 150 basis points to your CPI, or your competitive price index, for premium differentiation, et cetera. You want to highlight the value of your premium services. And in price sensitive markets, we talked about sort of lower income areas, especially the ones with kind of medium high level competition. You want to focus on efficiency, affordability, to attract and retain those customers. Service packages, right? They're very popular. If you don't have those, definitely encourage you to sort of create these service packages where the combined pricing, or the combined CBI, right, is actually lower than the individual service elements that are contained, right? But this offers customer value. This increases your transaction sizes by bundling things together. Good, better, best tiers are also important. It exists in many industries. It's really, really popular in the software industry, most notably, right? But think about implementing these good, better, best tiers, and I realizing that there's some limitations to that, which Chris will talk about. But these will actually drive some good ARO, and it will drive some good trade up, right? So if you set these tiers in a way where the price gaps are maybe really minimal between good and better, meaning customers would choose the better option all the time because the price gap between those two is very small, right? There's sort of scientific ways you can set this up, and then know what your positioning is. So what you see on the right side is, again, kind of very kind of typical positioning approach, but know where your brand is. So are you an auto service / tire shop that sits in between car dealers and national retailers? Okay, that's fine, but you need to be very clear about what your position is, and your pricing strategy should reflect that brand position, right? And so typically, kind of most regional, super regional chains will be here, right? You're going to be lower price than car dealers. Why? Because car dealers have to subsidize their kind of car sales, which make low margin on with higher repair costs. But you want to be perhaps higher than some of the national chains, or maybe some of the mom and pop shops. Why? Because you have a broader breadth of services, higher service level, et cetera. But I think one of the things, this whole good, better, best, great in theory, but Chris, maybe I would love your thoughts on like, how do we balance this with like the theoretical, the pricing theory with the actual realities in the industry?
Yeah. So one of the things, a question I would often get, and when I worked in the quick lube space, I consulted with a lot of franchisees, and I commonly get the question of, well, I'm going to have gaps between like the price for the different oils that I offer. How should I set those price gaps? And I think, my guidance there has always been, I think it like anything else that a statistician would say, right? It depends. And I think the more aspirational that the products are. So as an example, it might be that, well, good will satisfy, but I want the absolute best product on my car. I think in those situations, you can be a little bit more aggressive on how much room you put between those price gaps. I mean, in the research that we did, people tend to gravitate towards the middle. when you have like a three-tier option. And I think the more aspirational those tiers are, if you get a little bit overheated on how large you push that gap, what we would tend to notice is that people would trade down, but they wouldn't trade out altogether, and that's the main thing you're trying to guard against.
Yeah.
I think as the tiers become more necessity based, and that's something that's certainly been happening more in the auto industry over the years as manufacturers have changed their requirements so that you have some vehicles that require a full synthetic oil, or at a minimum, they require a synthetic blend. Then I think you have to be a little bit more careful about how wide you push those tiers, because you end up in a situation where people will trade out, because if they require a synthetic oil, the tiering doesn't matter to them. They never even look at the bottom tier price because it's not in their consideration set. So I think that's kind of what we experienced. We over the years we just continuously, it was an exercise in just gradually push the gap a little bit more, and I think as long as you're making small measured moves there, you're probably not going to break anything, and you'll at least find the breaking point long before you do any serious damage to anything.
Yeah, that's perfect, Chris. For those of you guys that subscribe to like magazines and things like that, I mean, again, like digital subscriptions do this quite well in terms of this good, better, best strategy. Obviously, without those limitations on necessity and things like that. So let's talk about markups on your parts, right? So most of you and most automotive retailers that are sort of listening to this recording, right? About half of your parts, at least, are going to come from externally sourced areas, right? So you're not going to stock them in the store. You'll stock tires and batteries and a few other things, right? But for the most part, you'll order them from parts retailers like O'Reilly, AutoZone, etc. So for these externally purchased parts, right, implementing a markup structure is important, but also a markup structure that is tiered, that is based on kind of the cost ranges of the particular items, right? So higher markup on more costly item or less costly items, right? A lower markup on really more expensive items. And ideally, you align these markup percentages, right, with the store segmentation model that we talked about, right? Remember, so again, we have a logical approach based on which segment the store belongs to, right? If you're at 100% list price index for high income, low competition areas, maybe you're 15% cheaper for low income, high competition, right? And so it's incredibly important to align kind of the markup structure with the store segmentation model in a logical manner. And you want to use your CPI indexing to sort of keep your parts pricing competitive while you capture the profits. Again, it's hard to get kind of scraped competitive prices for things outside of tires, but it's certainly possible, and there's ways to do that. I'll talk about that in a little bit later. But then also regularly adjust your markups. So review your markup strategy a couple of times a year, right, to make sure they're not too stale. And then maybe the last note on things that are kind of more specialized, harder to find. Consider value-based pricing that sort of reflects their criticality or their availability, rather than just sort of applying a standard markup on those. Labor rates. So I'll talk about these a little bit, just in the context of some of the customer research that we've done, right? But setting labor rates sort of in a strategic, again, logical manner involves several factors, right? So you want to align the rates with local shopper income levels or customer income levels to match their willingness to pay or their expectations, right? So again, more rural area, not a lot of competition, low income customers, you want to have one labor rate versus your urban stores, higher incomes, you want to have a different labor rate, right? You also want to factor in real estate costs, overhead expenses, right? Those can vary significantly by location. Sometimes they're respective of the incomes of people that live within kind of a 10-mile radius. You also want to implement tiered rates based on things like, I don't know, technician expertise to kind of reflect the value of that skilled labor, but also things like the make and model of the vehicle. Things like the age of the vehicle, right? As long as your point of sale system allows you to do that differentiation, it's actually really, really effective for you to do that and gain some additional profit for your business, which then will flow into your operating profits. And we talked about the competitive pricing database. So again, to the extent possible, build that competitive pricing database to ensure that it captures competitive labor rates, right? Again, either through mystery shopping or by leveraging websites like RepairPal, where you actually scrape services and labor rates for typical jobs within the zip code, and then regularly review them. Don't just set it and then just kind of forget it, but actually review them once or twice a year to make sure they stay updated. Chris, I know kind of labor rates is an important component of you kind of reviewing revenue management and profitability and things like that. Could you comment maybe on the tactical approaches to kind of pricing labor rates, and how do you manage the flexibility required in setting some of the subcomponent prices on the invoice?
Yeah, so I think, one of the things that, and this is kind of our thought process, or my thought process, is that when we look at store segmentation and price segmentation at the store level, you can make it as simple or as complicated as you want it to be. And I think, we know from research that, generally speaking, it's the total out the door price that is really what is the decision making consideration, I guess, for a customer, a lot more so than the individual subcomponents of what make up that total out the door price. And so, when I think about like labor rates in general, they fall into the same category from a customer viewpoint, that they're pretty much invisible to the customer, because even if they know your labor rate per hour, they don't necessarily have an appreciation for how many hours a job should take. So, and it's not like, most companies post their labor rate on the wall for everybody to see. And so I think with labor rates, one approach might be to set a consistent labor rate across a market. So you may have markets that are higher than others based upon, certainly you could index it towards what's the cost of labor in that market. And then perhaps, allow your markup on things like parts or your package pricing, allow that to actually execute your price segmentation by store. And the reason why I say that is because the labor rates are the one thing that, and this gets back to employees, it's easier for them to compare that from one store to the next. And so especially if you're sharing employees between stores, questions, whereas when your markup on parts, a lot of times that's invisible and in the background, and the average employee would never even notice. And so I think the more you can keep things simple for employees, and the less you have to educate and communicate to them about, why you do your pricing the way you do, the better off you are. Because I think anybody that's in this industry knows that turnover is high in this industry. And unless you're going to invest in a continuous education process for why you price the way you do, you're always going to end up with some employees that slip through the cracks. And so I think the more that we can keep things simple and reduce the number of questions, yet still accomplish our goal of price segmentation, I think the better off we are. And so things like labor rates that are more easily communicated, I think our strategy would be to, keep those consistent within a market. No reason why one market can't be higher than another market, because there's not great visibility to that. And then allow other things like parts to drive the price segmentation.
Yeah, that's great, Chris. And of course, if the invoice does end up being too high, or if the competition has a lower price, what do? We discount, right? And so I think when we discount, and Chris and I may have just maybe a slightly different point of view on kind of discounting limits or discounting guidelines, but one of the first things that's really important is knowing your costs, right? That's essential when we're doing discount, and not just calculating our gross margins, but also the contribution margins, to understand it to profitability. There is a difference between gross margins and contribution margins, right? For contribution margins, we want to consider all the variable costs. We want to make sure the discounts don't actually compromise our bottom line. So we want to set the discount limits to protect our profitability, right? We want to focus on specific sort of high margin or frequently needed services, but we could also implement sort of time limited offers, like any kind of time bound offer, free oil, free oil change this week, or 25% off of Michelin tires this week only, right? Creates a sense of urgency, drives immediate business, and it actually prevents sort of prolonged discounting that can erode margins. And then we also want to track the promotion results, right? So we want to have some analytics platform, whether it's built in a popular tech stack like Tableau or Power BI, or whether your point of sale system has some analytic capabilities, but you want to track the effectiveness of your discounts and truly understand if it's creating incremental car count, incremental gross profit, incremental sales, etc. The visual that you see is just simply measuring sort of discount curves. Those big charts that you see in orange are discount limits. This is actually a real example with fake data, but it's a real example from like a manufacturing industry. Those big orange bars correspond to discount authority levels from sales managers, regional directors, and I think regional VPs, those three big bars. And so what ends up happening in practice, if you set discount limits, guess what people are going to do? They're going to offer the discounts that their immediate manager or their skip level manager can approve. So if you have a discount limit of 25%, most people, it'll be human nature to just go to that 25% limit, as opposed to really thinking about who is the customer that's coming through the door, really understanding what is their willingness to pay, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think, Chris, maybe from your experience as an operator in this industry, just maybe some recommendations on how do we think about discount limits? Do they work? Do they not work? And then how do we sort of manage the employees with discount problems to drive some profitability?
Yeah, and I agree with everything you said there, and I think one of the things that I've learned is that setting like a discount limit at an aggregate level, because it's the old problem of how things get buried in averages, and so my observation in my days back at Valvoline was we had a franchisee that did this once. They set a limit that said we're not going to be above X number of dollars per car on discounts, and they set that out as a directive to their operations team, and they delivered. They did exactly what they wanted to do, and they also lost sales of the extra services, and so I think when you set like a limit at an aggregate level, I think it's the reality is it's hard sometimes to manage to that target. And so if I think about what happens at an employee level, usually you've got in a store, however many employees you got, you may have one or two employees that are really driving all the discounting, and others aren't so bad at it. And a lot of times what you find is that somebody that has a discounting problem, it's because it's kind of their go-to method of how they sell. They just always, the hallmark of a bad salesman, right, is they just always go to price and they try to discount. And so in those cases, like you've got kind of a choice to make. You can, try to turn the screws on that guy and get them to, tell them you don't discount so often. Well, the problem for those guys is that if they're just discounting all the time or discounting to every other customer or every person they think needs a discount, you've got a frequency problem, and you've maybe got a how much of a discount do they give problem. And I think the frequency problem is harder. It's harder to attack because you have to go to that employee and say, I don't want you to discount as much. Okay. How do they then figure out which employees that they were going to give a discount to? How do they figure out which ones to pull back from? And typically they're going to be very bad at that. They don't, if they were good at it already, they would have already figured that out. And so I think what is, and maybe a more helpful approach is to say, okay, we need to limit discounts on a per, usage basis. And then hopefully that gets you to ultimately to your aggregate target. But as Armin pointed out, it's a double-edged sword, because if you say, here's the limit, you can't go above this, do people kind of gravitate towards, okay, well, that's what I can give. I'm authorized to give that. So there's no easy answer on discounts. It's very tricky. I think in a perfect world, a point of sale system that could dynamically offer customers discounts, and you could take the discount decision out of the hands of employees, that would be nirvana, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, that's perfect. And we'll talk about that a little bit as well, Chris, like this whole idea of how do we have some customer segmentation intelligence in our point of sale that offers real-time discounts. And I think it's, to your point, it's nirvana in the industry. All of the capabilities certainly exist. So I'll maybe we can go through this next, and I think we'll kind of accelerate the next couple of slides just because we have a ton of content for you guys. But obviously, like, some of the strategies that work well in terms of discounting, right? So seasonal discounts, this can be a very choppy industry, particularly when we think about like tire sales, right? Depending on where you are in the US and or Canada or the world, right? So seasonal discounts kind of help some of these slower periods, help kind of normalize some of the dips in revenue. Special promotions, so things like National Car Care Month, they can attract customers by offering these time-bound incentives. Loyalty programs can work. There's kind of mixed feelings about loyalty programs, but they can work with points or sort of tiered rewards to hopefully encourage repeat visits and higher spending, but they have to be carefully managed. Things like volume discounts, right, for bulk services or fleet customers can actually be really, really impactful in driving larger transactions and securing some long-term business. So fleet customers are, they're typically going to be lower gross margin percentage than your kind of regular consumers, but it's a really healthy business because you do have the volume of transactions coming through. So if your mix of fleet businesses is lower relative to your kind of regular consumers, I encourage you guys to try to build that business up. And the referral discounts are effective, not just for this business, but really any kind of service-oriented retail business. So leveraging kind of the word of mouth marketing by giving referral discounts to consumers is a good way to acquire new ones and reward some of the existing customers that you have. And I think on this one, Chris, you probably have a strong opinion on these loyalty programs, particularly in the auto repair industry. So maybe you can kind of talk about that.
Yeah, and for the sake of time, I'll try to keep it brief. But yeah, my opinion on them is generally negative in this industry, and for the main reason of visit frequency in this industry is so low. So a good customer, you might see them 3 times a year, or actually a great customer. And so that was what we saw in the Quick Lubes. Like we couldn't make a loyalty program per se really pay out because the problem was the long-term value of a customer wasn't high enough in order to be able to afford to give out a reward that was big enough for a customer to even care about. I think in general auto repair, it might be a little different because there's much greater revenue on a per ticket basis and on per customer basis. You're doing much bigger repairs. But I think the one watch out is that if stores aren't really working the program and getting customers to sign up, then ultimately you just end up paying an agency to run that program for you. That's some monthly fee, and it's probably not going to deliver much in the way of value. So that's just kind of my general feedback there.
Yeah, no, those are really fair points, Chris. Similar to sort of discounts potentially hurting your profitability, right? And this notion of being surgical with discounts, we have to be surgical with pricing overrides, right? So we have to establish clear pricing policies for our retail organization and procedures to have some sort of consistency, and to sort of avoid these unnecessary pricing overrides, right? Pricing overrides, i.e. somebody kind of overrides the list price. And sometimes they heavily override it, right? Because of whatever reason. Some reasons are legitimate, right? Customer comes in, says competition wants to do this, whatever suspension job for X amount. We want to go, 95% times X, right? We want to be a little bit under so we can actually win that customer. But otherwise, there's a ton of pricing overrides, not just in this industry, in any retail industry, where the staff has the flexibility to do that. And so one of the things we need to do is we need to train our employees on the importance to sort of adhering to prices, or at least to understand the impact of pricing overrides, right? And how do we judiciously kind of do these pricing overrides in a way that lets us win the customer, but also in a way that lets us kind of maintain our profit targets, right? We want to allow some kind of optimal or limited flexibility, whatever that limited flexibility means. Could be up to 20%, up to 15%, up to 30%, or maybe it's kind of flexibility depending on service category, et cetera. And kind of offer this with some manager approval if you want to go above that pricing override. But it needs to be formalized. It needs to be kind of crafted with your company leaders, right? So your regional directors, sales managers, et cetera. So everybody's on board with what these are, right? You also want to implement some kind of a feedback mechanism for your staff to report on pricing challenges and provide suggestions for improvement, and to articulate the profit impact of their pricing overrides, right? And there's not just the articulation element, but there's also the kind of the scenario analysis element of, hey, what would happen if you were just to reduce your pricing overrides to be at the region average, or to be, to reduce it by 10%? What is the impact to the bottom line? By the way, how does that translate to your annual bonus? So you translate profit impacts to kind of bonus impacts to especially management. That can have a huge impact. The other piece is key metrics, right? As you think about pricing and revenue management, there's some key metrics. There's many other ones that I didn't include, like things like price realization, just because it's a little bit harder to wrap our heads around. But certainly for our industry, right? So things like average repair order matters, right? We can increase that by doing service bundling that we talked about. We can offer strategic upsell opportunities by sort of identifying additional services that can be done at a visit. Digital inspections have obviously accelerated that, but it's really something that we need to hammer home on, is this whole idea of strategic upsell in a way that makes sense for the customer, and certainly in a way that will make sense for our wallets, right? We can boost the car count by pricing competitively in popular services and implementing the promotions for like first-time customers to attract new business, right? We can also improve customer retention through, maybe loyalty programs that we talked about, but also things like proactive customer engagements and proactive customer outreach, right? So we can actually maximize the customer lifetime value by focusing both on the retention, so letting customers stay longer with us, or incenting customers to stay longer with us, and increasing the transaction per visit, right, or the average repair order, because that will actually ensure that we drive not just kind of short-term profitability for a fiscal year, but also increasing the customer lifetime value and long-term profitability. Chris, I know you have a ton of experience with driving strategic upsells. Maybe you can talk about that, and maybe talk about the impact of the visual inspections on sort of driving these sales.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've kind of noted in the auto industry in general, and going back to my experience in the Quick Lubes, items that are visually inspected are typically really easy to upsell to customers, and it's really easy to sell a customer on a bulb that is broken, or an air filter that is dirty, because the customer can see it. And my observation has been that, and I can't, I'm not going to share service penetration percentages from my days at Valvoline, but I would just say that I think most operators in kind of the repair space would be shocked to realize how much money they're leaving on the table by not simply focusing on those items that they're not big upsells. These aren't high dollar items, but the amount that you can potentially sell, it adds up to quite a bit of money, and it really just comes down to inspecting and presenting to the customer. If they kind of sell themselves in many ways, and so it's in trying to increase average repair order, it's something that I think every operator should look at, and look at it pretty. There's a lot of opportunity there.
That's a really good point. And I will just add, it doesn't work for everyone. I think there's like skeptics like my wife, Chris, who I think she went to a store last couple of weeks and she was presented with a dirty air filter, right? And her initial reaction was like, "Oh, really? Would you present this random dirty air filter that you just grabbed from your whatever? Would you present it to my husband?" And so I think sometimes it's like, as it can have the opposite effect on people by kind of thinking that it's some sort of a gimmick. But of course, automotive technicians have sort of the right intent, and it is really your air filter, right? So they're really good points.
I was going to say that that's a good point, because the one watch out on visually inspected items is they can lead to pressure if you're putting something right in somebody's face, and so that there's a balance there for sure. For sure. Yep. So guys, let's pivot real quick. Let's talk about tire sales. And I know some of you on this call and kind of people who will watch this, right? They do a really good balance of kind of tire sales as well as kind of service and repair. But obviously, kind of despite relatively low gross margin percentages, tire sales are critical, right? They're critical profit drivers simply because of their high unit prices and the volume opportunities, right? So if you're kind of a higher mix of service and repair, lower mix of tire sales type retailer,
yeah, you want to think about how do you actually increase the mix of tire sales, and you do that through marketing and through kind of supply chain improvements, obviously. But if you have tires as part of your portfolio, you want to implement dynamic pricing strategies because you want to balance that competitiveness with profitability, right? And when I say dynamic, again, it doesn't have to be complicated. It's as simple as understanding by market and by brand, by tier, right, by size. What is the competitive price index that you want to index to key competitors, be it national or super regional, and sort of monitoring that and making some adjustments. You also want to focus on selling higher margin, right? Higher margin premium tire brands. So we're talking tier one, maybe tier two, to maximize that gross profit per unit. Those tend to also maximize customer lifetime value, right? There is something about premium tire brand customers. They come more often. They do additional services versus your tier three or tier four. But speaking of tier three, tier four, you should also consider introducing private label tires. If you're big enough, you're multi-location chain, right? You want to have private label. It's pretty popular with some of the bigger chains, right? They tend to have really high margins, not just margin percentage, but also margin per unit. They can also help fill your gap in your product range, right? Without sort of compromising that overall price perception. And the last couple of things you want to think about kind of bundled offers for tires, pairing them with complementary services, right? That kind of increases the transaction value for that particular customer. And you want to have kind of a robust tire inventory management and optimization system, right? So not just inventory management, but also things like automated pricing markdowns, et cetera, right? So you want to make sure you have the right tires in stock, right? That are the most popular for given location for a given time to kind of minimize the lost sales. But if you happen to be kind of over procuring tires and you end up with a bunch of dusty tires in your store warehouse, or in the back room somewhere, you want to have a nicely structured price markdown schedule so you can actually offload that in a profitable manner. Okay, so let's talk about shop supply fees, right? It's another one, and Chris actually alluded to this. That corresponds to a detailed research that we did based on 2,000 consumers, a little over 2,000, where we sort of asked them a series of questions, and it was part of a dynamic conjoint analysis that we did. We're trying to figure out to what extent do people that visit auto repair and tire stores pay attention to shop supply fees versus the total invoice, right? And so what you'll notice is people care much more, like Chris said, they care much more about the total invoice price versus things like shop supply fees. In fact, the people care much more about like how long is it going to take for my car to be ready, right? So the heavy preference, obviously, for like if it's 5 hours or less versus like 7 hours or more, right? You see a big sort of shift in consumer preferences, right? And again, you don't need to understand what all the details are. Just kind of pay attention to the size of these bars that are going left and right. Things like labor rates, people are a lot more okay with labor rates differing, right? So they pay less attention to whether your labor rate is $170 versus $200, right? Because they associate that with sort of a human putting in manual kind of labor to get their car ready, and they care much more about how long is it going to take, what is my total invoice price. And so implementing these shop supply fees, that's actually a really effective way to, one, legitimately recoup some kind of miscellaneous costs that are associated with that, but also can contribute to overall profitability. And so if you look at most competitors, typically between 5 to 10% of the invoice total, but you want to have some caps, right? Because there's some psychological thresholds around shop supplies. Like if it's $100 or above, it may stick out on the invoice a little bit greater and can have some negative customer reaction. So typically there's a cap between $30 or $100 depending on the retailer. And again, you want to focus on the total invoice rather than individual line items because customers are going to be generally more concerned with the overall cost. And then you also want to align your fee structure with sort of your local market norms, right? Because you want to remain competitive. You don't want to seem like you're gouging your customers. And you want to consider varying these shop supply fees based on your store segmentation that you've done. Membership programs, another useful way. It's not very kind of popular, certainly not for kind of smaller regional chains, but you can also think about like an Amazon-like subscription model where you have a premium membership, actually drive customer loyalty, right? And I forgot to flip the slide, but you can actually, develop these membership models, whether it's $99 a year, whatever that is, and you can offer, things like priority scheduling, discounted services, etc. But these are really useful ways to, one, just get some recurring revenue, to create some sort of a premiumized differentiation for these customers that are entering the membership programs, and also get them to come more often, right? And so again, all in the interest to drive up customer lifetime value. Just like what we did with stores, where we segmented the stores, it's really important that you segment your customers. And whether you do this through a sophisticated point of sale system that you use, fair warning, in this industry, there's not a lot of point of sale systems that do this. So you probably want to do this outside using, again, some very popular business intelligence tools that ingest your data. But you want to do some RFM analysis. RFM just stands for recency, frequency, monetary. So, how recently did this particular customer transact? When was the last time they were in our store? How often do they come in a given period? That's frequency. So in a given year, do they visit us 3 times, like Chris mentioned, 4 times, or they only visit like once? And monetary, when they do visit us, how much money do they spend? And so you want to have a clear understanding when a customer walks through your door. What is their RFM score? What is their profile, right? Because based on that, you can develop, issue sort of discounts in a personalized manner for some screen that pops up, whether it's in an iPad or the actual terminal. Hey, this customer, you can offer them a discount between this and this range based on their RFM segmentation profile, right? You can also develop win-back offers for lapsed customers to re-engage them and sort of encourage repeat business. You can implement some dynamic pricing or dynamic promotions, right, based on these profiles. And again, these are all fairly foundational, simple things. You have the data for your retailers and your retail chains. And so it's just a matter of kind of doing the analysis and making sure it's automatically refreshed every week and served up for you in the stores. One thing that I do want to touch base on before we kind of finish off, we have like 5 minutes, and get Chris's kind of point of view at the end, is this whole idea of adjusting pricing based on capacity. So we know that shop capacity can vary, and sometimes your bays are super busy, sometimes they're not. And so this is the idea of adjusting pricing based on shop capacity and demand forecasts, right? Because you want to maximize your revenue and kind of manage the customer flow. And so you can certainly implement some surge pricing during high demand periods. And surge pricing doesn't have to mean that your list prices are higher. It could just simply mean that you're offering less discounts during those periods, right? And then the inverse is also true, right? Where you're during really slow periods, or during really slow periods, you can offer some incremental discounts. But it's a really popular thing to do in most retail environments. I haven't seen that done, at least not in a structured manner in this industry. But Chris, maybe you can kind of share your kind of point of view with some of the challenges that may exist with capacity-based pricing in this industry.
I think one of the key challenges is can a point of sale system support it? Number one. Number two, I think and I've seen a lot of providers do this in the past, whether it's Quick Lubes or even auto maybe offering like an early bird special to get people there early in the morning. In my experience, one of the challenges there is that if you're having to execute that via giving a discount, and that's how we would have had to do it in our system that I was working for at the time, was the early bird price was till 10 a.m. and they had to give a discount in order to get to the actual price. The problem that you can run into is how you advertise that. So we advertised it by simply hanging a banner outside the store, and the problem was it was a lot of work to hang that banner and take it down. So the banner just stood up all day long, and so then you create an issue where, well, what if a customer comes in at 10:05, or what if they come in at 10:30, or what if they come in at noon? And because as long as there's a sign up there, people will ask for the discount, and so it can be difficult to shut off the discounting after the appropriate time if employees, again, aren't really educated on the value that they're delivering. And so I think there's challenges there. There's other ways you can communicate, off peak times. For like in the Quick Lube industry, Tuesdays and Wednesdays were pretty slow days of the week. And so trying to use other marketing tactics, whether it was direct mail or things like that, to educate customers that, hey, we've got a deal, or bring your car in now. Those are all things that you can try. I can tell you that in my experience, they had limited success. It's hard. it's hard to get people to change their behavior, if they're already in kind of a routine pattern. But from an employee standpoint, the watch out is how do you execute it, and can you execute it and turn it off when it needs to be turned off, and only turn it on when it needs to be turned on.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Chris. Guys, let me skip through or at least accelerate the last few slides. I know we have 2 minutes, and I'm conscious of everybody's time. So a few other things. One, private label credit cards. It's incredibly powerful. Most of you have it. If not, definitely encourage you guys, right? So there's some popular programs, credit programs in this industry. What we know is, like all kind of retail industries, private label shoppers spend more, right? So the ARO in this business is typically about 2x of what a non-private label credit card shopper is. Customer lifetime value can easily be 3 to 4 times. Why? Because they spend more per visit, and they also visit us more. And so, implementing that certainly drives up customer loyalty and increases spending. You can also think about it offering promotional financing, right? So again, collaboration with obviously with the credit issuer, but typically this industry does no interest for 6 months if you purchase over 500. One of the things you can think about is actually tiering this. So no interest for 12 months if you spend over 1,500, et cetera. It's a really good way to actually drive up ARO. The other thing that I'll mention is focus on gross profit dollars and not margin to actually drive operating profit and profitability overall for your business, right? So focus on strategies that drive higher sales dollars because the absolute gross profit is going to be more critical than the gross margin percentage. So I'm not going to belabor this point, but this is really important to kind of build this culture of gross profit dollars versus gross margin percentages, right? Last few slides, we're simply trying to illustrate the fact that you need to have the right data infrastructure in place, right? So we talked about competitive pricing that are being scraped or mystery shopping, et cetera. But you need to organize those in a structured manner and housed in some data warehouse, ideally some cloud-based data warehouse, right? If you're a Microsoft shop, put them in Azure cloud data warehouse, so it's easily accessible. You can do all sorts of analytics. And you want to have some kind of a real-time pricing insights. And so when I say real-time, it's sort of daily updates of tracking discount percentages, frequencies, right? Setting up dynamic alerts if there's any kind of profitability issues, discount issues, et cetera, et cetera. You should use advanced analytics, right? So we talked about price elasticities. We talked about customer lifetime value, both kind of measuring historical customer lifetime value, but also kind of predicting what the anticipated customer lifetime value is for certain customers. You want to be able to do scenario analyses. What happens if I increase my price by 1, 2, 3, 4%? What is the impact of my business in terms of revenues, in terms of gross profit margins, in terms of gross profit dollars? What is the impact to my operating profit? These are incredibly useful capabilities to have. And by the way, these are table stakes nowadays. So if you don't have those today, you need to build those in. We talked about competitive analysis. So it's really important to sort of integrate your competitive price monitoring using the web scraping tools or whatever else, right? To actually to monitor your price competitiveness across various products and services. And again, developing that competitive price index for key services, product categories by kind of market or by store segment is really important, and be able to track those every week and understand where you're leaving money on the table, or understand where you need to perhaps heat up your pricing is also really crucial. We talked about targeted pricing and promotional strategies for different customer segments. That's obviously important. You want to be able to track those. You want to be able to set up promotional effectiveness analyses. And so that's an example that you see on the right side. And so what we try to do in each of these cases is to give you guys at least a glimpse of how the analytics may look like, the pricing analytics for each of these things. Right? So you see net price realization on the previous slide. You see promotional analytics effectiveness on this slide. On the following slide, we'll sort of included a visual of, hey, how do you actually track net price realization, right? That's an important metric for a business. Every 1% price realization, i.e. price increase of 1% and volumes and costs kind of remaining steady, every 1% net price realization adds about 11% to your operating profit. And guess what it does to your valuation, right? So if you're an owner of a multi-chain business, right, like driving price realization has a direct impact into the valuation of your business. So when you try to sell that business, you're going to get, 10, 20, 50, $100 million more because you've done pricing the right way. So it has a direct impact on valuation. And then lastly, just the framework on how to think about customer and product segmentation, right? So you always want to think in terms of how relevant that particular service or product is, like how big is it? How many dollars am I generating? And then what is the gross margin, right? So there's things like what we call dead zones, right? That are kind of, low gross margin and very low sales. You either want to get rid of these things or you want to consolidate them, maybe do some SKU rationalization or increase the prices. These are background items that nobody really pays attention to. And you can actually extend that logic to incorporate price competitiveness. So one of the easiest ways to drive margin for your business, and again, this is a fairly kind of typical pricing tactical effort that most companies can do, is look at your low performing items that are low margin. Perhaps you even look at your kind of middle performing or low performing items or middle of the road margins. Take a look at the ones that are where you're just substantially cheaper than competition, 5, 10, 15, 20% cheaper than competition, right? That happens. Why? Because most businesses don't have a good kind of pricing anomaly detection system. They don't sort of track price realization and price competitiveness metrics. So inevitably, you will have a ton of your services that are ripe for price increases because you're just so much cheaper than competition. That can add a substantial value and substantially impact to your bottom line and to your overall profitability and valuation. Okay, there's some more examples on profitability and discount stack ranking for your field teams. So again, I'm not going to belabor that, but you'll have the slides. And then again, I think just kind of to conclude the webinar, my only ask of you is to just really start paying attention to pricing and revenue management for your business, right? It's a really powerful way to maximize your profitability and actually drive sustainable growth for this industry beyond inorganic growth, which has been sort of the case. Leverage advanced analytics. So if you don't have things like dynamic dashboards set up in your business using Power BI or Tableau, whatever else, if you don't have a way to run easy scenario analysis on your business, what happens if I increase or decrease my pricing? What happens if I decrease my discounting? What is the impact to my business? And you can't answer those questions within kind of a few minutes. That's a real opportunity to build for your business because quite frankly, those are table stakes capabilities nowadays. Guys, thank you so much for attending. A huge thanks for Chris for also spending the time with us and kind of helping to facilitate this webinar. And so hopefully we can kind of work together and drive pricing, drive revenue management, and drive profitability for the business. Again, you'll receive the recording, you'll receive the slides, and you'll receive the white paper that Chris and I have written. So if you find any value in this, please don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you very much. Enjoy the day.